Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I come to you with my entry into the BookTube tradition of Friday Reads. As I mentioned in a recent video, my goal this Black History Month is to explore the 6 chronological sections of the Zora Canon, a list of classic works of fiction and nonfiction by African American women writers. This week, I've been reading primarily from the first section, called A Fight for Our Humanity, covering the literature of the period from about 1859 until the turn of the 20th century. The Zora Canon doesn't list the earliest writing by African Americans. Phillis Wheatley is generally recognized as the first African American to publish a book, a few years before the American Revolution. Born in Senegal, Wheatley was captured and sold into slavery as a young girl and taken to Boston, Massachusetts, when slavery was still legal there. The family who owned her taught her to read, something that in later years and other places was often illegal. With the support of her owner, apparently, Wheatley was able to get her book published in England. Soon after its publication, her master freed her. In general, her poetry isn't likely to appeal to most contemporary readers, I don't think, but one thing that might appeal is the wonderful picture book about Phillis Wheatley, Phyllis's Big Test, written by the historian Catherine Clinton and beautifully illustrated by Sean Qualls, which tells the story of how her poetry found its way into publication. The first book of the Zora Canon is Harriet Wilson's Our Nig, published in 1859. The book is often considered the first novel written in the U.S. by an African American, by a man or by a woman. Scholars sometimes make 2 small quibbles about this claim. First, Wilson's book bears enough similarities to her actual experiences that some readers think the book should be not called a novel, that it's an autobiographical work instead, despite the fact that it shares many constructed elements with the domestic novels of the period. And secondly, Hannah Craft's bondswoman narrative was written several years before. It too has some features of autobiography, but this work is also heavily influenced by the style of the sentimental novels of the era, including the work of Charles Dickens. But the major difference? While Hannah Craft's book was written in 1852, it was published for the first time in 2002. Our Nig was published a century and a half earlier, and was therefore part of the literary discussion for all those years, although perhaps not as much as you might think. I'll get to that in a minute. Harriet Wilson's Our Nig is the story of Fredo, a young mixed-race girl abandoned by her mother, a promiscuous white woman, after Fredo's African-American father had died. She is left at the house of a middle-class white family, the Belmonts, where she lives and works as a servant to the family. Let me say right up front that the title is, of course, just a shorthand for the full derogatory term. I am going to continue to use the title, although I won't use the full expletive. The author chose to use this word in order to point out mistreatment and injustice, and it doesn't seem right to erase it completely here. Even when the nickname is used in a relatively non-pejorative situation in the book, it's clearly pointing to the fact that Fredo will always be seen as separate and as inferior by those who apply the term to her. Fredo is a very young girl when she's taken in by the Belmonts and made their servant. She is abused, both physically and emotionally, by Mrs. Belmont and by some of her children. In contrast, Mr. Belmont is much kinder to her. I mentioned that the author utilized some of the tropes of sentimentalist domestic fiction, including novels by white abolitionists like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, but she also turned some of those conventions on their heads. For example, Harriet Wilson rejects the valorization of the domestic and the feminine. Instead of the angel in the house, we see something really different here. Repeatedly, white women treat Fredo horribly, but men, black and white, are often relatively kind to her, though they don't often stand up for her or protect her from the cruelty. This response to or criticism of the sentimental trope of the kindly white woman is interesting, as is the author's flip of ideas about sexuality and race. In this novel, the white woman is the promiscuous character, not the black woman and not the black men. If your goal is to understand more about the historical roots of African American literature in the 20th and 21st centuries, I highly recommend Our Nig. But it isn't necessarily a book that really stands on its own outside its historical and literary context. The book is overly sentimental, and at least to 21st century readers, seems to have characters that are stereotypes, or at least characters that fit a certain literary pattern that now seems oversimplified and dated. Characters are cruel without any efforts to understand where that cruelty came from, or what it means in their lives to treat others with such disrespect and abuse. The simplistic character portrayals make this a flawed book. Still, even if you don't read it, it's worth knowing a bit about it. Although Harriet Wilson's book is really interesting and has a lot to add to the picture of major themes in the history of African American literature across the decades, it was a book fairly roundly ignored by white readers in the 19th century. Even abolitionists were disturbed by it. Why? Perhaps because it was so critical of the way race relations worked in the North. Fundamentally, white abolitionists embraced books that were critical of slavery, not books that were critical of racism. What Fredo experiences, and what Wilson writes about, is the almost pseudo-slavery often experienced by African Americans in the North before the Civil War. No, she absolutely doesn't equate that treatment to the experience of chattel slavery in the South. Not at all. But she does condemn the construction of race relations and racial power in the North. Perhaps because I've just read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye this past month, I was intrigued by some similarities between the character of Fredo and the character of Pecola. They come to very different ends, and they get there because of different patterns of abuse, but there's still quite an echo. Have any of you read both these books? I'm eager to see what you think. You may have already noticed that I'm the kind of reader who not only reads books back to back that I think have something in common, but find something in common when I read two books which I don't expect to be connected. For example, I spent a while thinking about the deep resonances between particular elements of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and Toni Morrison's novel, a comparison I would not be shocked to hear that no one has done before, but which seemed perfectly natural to me because I was reading them at the same time. I did refrain from posting about that. The second book listed in the Zora Canon is Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Although this book is often considered a true slave narrative, it, like so many other slave narratives, shares much in common with the stylistic features of mid-century fiction. Although the hybrid work, combining autobiography and novel, was pretty common in 19th century American fiction as a whole, as we just saw with Harriet Wilson's Our Nig, that hybridizing was nowhere more common than it was in the genre of what we then and now call slave narratives. Just as we think of the modern memoir as a genre where authors use literary conventions as they craft a story that is at least primarily their true story, many published slave narratives were a combination of true experiences and the popular literary forms of the day. By definition of the genre, slave narratives were typically written by fugitive slaves and detail their experiences as enslaved people, their efforts to escape slavery, and often their attempts to build new lives as free people. When I was a junior or senior in college, I first read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in an edition which had just been published, complete with extensive notes by the scholar Jean Fagan Yellen. Yellen starts her commentary by saying that she had first read the slave narrative a decade before and accepted the belief back then that it was a false slave narrative, one put together as fiction by Lydia Maria Child. Several years later, when Yellen read Child's insistence that she was the editor and not the author of the slave narrative, Yellen combed through archives and found compelling evidence that Harriet Jacobs was the author and that the story was, at heart, true. Clearly, some elements are fictional, including the main character's name, but many elements of the basic flow of events are easily documentable. I'm not sure that really matters for most readers, but it matters to historians who seek to understand more about the African American experience of slavery and freedom. Enslaved by Dr. Norcom in North Carolina, Harriet Jacobs, going by the pseudonym Linda Brent, is subjected to sexual harassment for more than a decade. Norcom refuses to allow Jacobs to marry another man and removes her from the other slaves in his household. He repeatedly pressures her to become his concubine. Eventually, she escapes and lives for 7 years in a tiny crawl space of a family member's house. This image is stunning. This little coffin of a spot is both a prison, a place of confinement, and also the place of her freedom, her liberation. Somehow, Jacobs manages to avoid violent physical abuse when she's enslaved, but the damage to her is nonetheless horrific. Despite her psychological strength and her ability to embrace the spirit of resistance, she's forced to make choices that are heartbreaking. But to quote Jacobs, "My master had power and law on his side. I had determined will. There is might in each." Jacobs' might is what continues to ring out all these years later. Jacobs' narrative was published soon after the narrative of Frederick Douglass. What she adds to his powerful story is a picture of how different the experiences of Black women were, of how different their responses and their goals could be. I want to read you a passage where Yellen explains what she sees as so powerful in Harriet Jacobs' book. In Jacobs' hand, the passive female of the captivity narrative acts to save herself. In her hand, the slave narrative is changed from the story of a hero who single-handedly seeks freedom and literacy to the story of a hero tightly bound to family and community who seeks freedom and a home for her children. In her hand, the pathetic, seduced, tragic mulatto of white fiction is metamorphosed from a victim of white male deception and fickleness into an inexperienced girl making desperate choices in her struggle for autonomy. The mammy of white fiction becomes not the white baby's nurse, but the nurturer and liberator of her own children. In her hand, the madwoman in the attic sanely plots for her freedom. Instead of studying self-control within a domestic setting, the young woman learns to engage in political action. Well, after reading and thinking a lot about Black women writers and their works this week, especially how these works talk about sexuality and sexual violence, I was intrigued to see a related essay in the late January edition of the London Review of Books, an article called "Nothing Natural" by Jenny Turner. You could be forgiven for not seeing the link between the slave narrative and a long review about feminist ideas about surrogacy, The link is via Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. I mentioned that I read Harriet Jacobs' narrative when I was in late college. Around the same time, I read Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. As a Southern historian who read a lot about the experiences of enslaved women on white plantations, I was really disturbed by Atwood's story, for reasons that are elucidated in the pages of the LRB. Citing the author of the surrogacy book, Jenny Turner talks about how Atwood's world is, in a weird way, wishful, a dystopia that functions as a utopia. She goes on, imagine how much easier politics would be if the only thing standing in the way of peace and harmony was, as she puts it, evil religious fundamentalists with guns. You wouldn't need to worry about capitalism or racism or your own complicity in both or either. In short, The Handmaid's Tale is, as author Sophie Lewis calls it, a deraced slave narrative. It's deraced in two ways. One, African Americans are completely removed from the narrative and resettled by those in control of Gilead and, of course, by Atwood herself in another part of the country. The other way is because the story that Atwood constructs is a story that has been written before, lived before, by African American women. Let me quote from the review essay again. The situation of the fertile handmaid in Atwood's novel, forcibly separated from her own child and made to live in the house of a rich man, clearly borrows, as Lewis says, from the historical experience of the African American plantation, while deftly, silently adapting it for the purposes of a colorblind, that is, white, feminism. During this upcoming week, I plan to read a couple of selections from the second chronological period of the Zora list, A Rebirth of the Arts, covering the period from 1924 to 1953. This time period spans the years of the Harlem Renaissance and includes authors such as Nella Larson and Zora Neale Hurston herself, as well as Ann Petrie and the early works of Gwendolyn Brooks. I can't wait to get started, and I promise to come back next week to tell you all about it on Hannah's Books. See you soon.